people, its philosophy, its religion over the years. I'm your moderator, Jim Minkler, and I'm happy to bring to you some of the greatest characters in Chinese history today, as they shall present themselves to you, introduce a little bit about their lives, a little bit about their philosophy towards life. And our first speaker today is one that was not Chinese. However, we can attribute to him the ability to bring all of China together under one rule. And this individual is probably known to all of you, Genghis Khan, who his first relationship with Beijing, at that time it was called Zhongdu, was to threaten it with attack in 1214. Well, rather than being attacked, they sent him a princess, they sent him lots of gold, lots of treasure, lots of expensive things to placate him, and they were able to do it. He turned around and he rode off. But in leaving Zhongdu, Beijing, he heard that they were then evacuating the city and moving south. He thought, aha, what they're doing is that they're moving away so they can amass their armies and attack me. So he turned around and laid siege to the city, which was quite surprising. But without further ado, we have Dale Marcy from the North Idaho College Science Department portraying Genghis Khan. Genghis?
My name is Temujin. I was born on the steppes of Mongolia, north of the Chinese empires. It was a very harsh environment. My family migrated north to south each season in search of provisions for the horses and the sheep, and so that we could procure fresh water. It's a very tough society, a very tough environment. There's great competition between the tribes for the resources. My father was poisoned by the Tartars when I was 6 years old. I spent the rest of my life avenging that death. It was my duty as an individual in my tribe. A man's role in the society was that of a warrior. From a very young age, we were conditioned to become warriors. At 3 years old, we would be strapped on a horse, taught to ride, given a bow, so that we could learn to shoot. Life on the steppe made a warrior of every youngster. My sons asked me once, what is the greatest enjoyment in life? And I said, a man's greatest good fortune is to chase and defeat his enemies, seize his total possessions, ride his geldings, leave his women weeping and wailing, and use his handmaidens for a nightshirt. My enemies called me a barbarian, but vengeance was part of my society. It was the basis for justice. The duty to avenge was a man's right. It was passed on from generation to generation. How did I become Genghis Khan, the emperor of the world? I started as an orphan. How did I rise to such power? It's because I was a great warrior. Many stories have been told of my bravery, of my daringness, of my ability on horseback. But there were many great warriors among the Mongols. My abilities were far greater than being a warrior and using a bow or a scimitar. My abilities lie in my ability to plan attacks. Warriors that fought with me realized I had great skill in assessing my enemy's weaknesses and striking only when I could be successful. I also developed a system of communication among my followers. It was very difficult to control individuals. You had to control the individuals if you were going to be an effective fighting force. As other tribes recognized my ability to conquer, they aligned with me. And in 1206, I was elected by my followers as Genghis Khan, the emperor of the world. My empire would stretch from the Danube River to the Pacific Ocean, about 5,000 miles. To maintain an empire this large, one had to have an organized army. The army was the basis of my strength, was the power of my empire. The reason I could control the army was because I reorganized it. Society, as I was a child, was dominated by individual desires, the need to exact vengeance. I understood that this was not acceptable if I was going to be successful as an emperor. I reorganized my army so that individuals were promoted on their skill, not on their family allegiance. I organized it so that 10 men were in one squad, 10 squads to a battalion, 10 battalions to a brigade. Each man could rise up as his skill allowed. I made sure during the sacking of cities and the plundering of our enemies that the bounty was distributed to all soldiers equally based on their rank. This promoted great loyalty. It made me very successful. I then organized the society in the same way. To maintain such a large army, we had to have a supply line, so each soldier had a family that supported it. So the families were reorganized, breaking old blood ties. It allowed me to control the society. The organization of society overcame the individual conflicts and the instability that was caused by the individuals. My Mongol Empire was born of war, and my army maintained the control of my empire. But I could pay my army well with the plunder that we took from my enemies. My rule brought bounty to my society. Before Genghis Khan, the Mongols ate dogs and mice and wore the skins of those animals. Under my rule, their pockets are lined with riches. Their clothing is made of silk. They eat meals from fine pottery. Trade lines are opened across the entire continent so that wealth can be brought to my people. My rule has improved my people.
Thank you, Genghis. Our next character will be portrayed by Karen Streeter. This character, Jing, lived from 1913 to 1991. I'll let you be the judge, but she influenced China perhaps more profoundly than anybody else in many different ways in the 20th century. You be the judge of whether that was good or bad.
I am Chang, fourth wife of Chinese leader Mao Zedong. Our marriage spanned nearly 40 years. The first few years, I was not active politically, but beginning in the 1960s, I worked closely with Mao. I should have become empress after his death, but my enemies took that from me. They cheated me of my destiny. But first, let me tell you how I came to be here. I was born in 1913 in Chang. I was given the name Shu Ming, meaning pure and simple. My mother was the concubine of Li Duan, who also was known as Thieving Wolf and Master of Cursing. He was cruel to both me and my mother, often beating me and once beating my mother with a spade. Ours was not the close-knit Chinese family that you read about. My mother and I fled my father's home, but it was difficult for her to earn a living to support both of us. She worked as a domestic servant. We finally had to leave Chang and go to Sinan, where we lived with my grandparents. To mark a new phase of my life, my name became Yunhee, meaning crane in the clouds. When I was about 14, I discovered the theater. In 1929, I was accepted as a student in a dramatic academy and joined a theatrical troupe. This was a wonderful time in my life. It was here at the academy that I first met my first husband, Mr. Fay, who had come to the academy to see a production in which I had a part. When the academy closed in 1930, we married and moved into his family's home. I soon realized what a mistake I had made, and we divorced, much to my grandparents' embarrassment. I returned to the theater and began my film career in Shanghai in 1934. Here again, to mark the beginning of a new phase in my life, I again took the name of Lan Ping, meaning blue apple. I became active in politics here. There was a new wave of political movement that was against imperialism and capitalism, called communism. I did not join the party at this time, but because of my association with the communists, I was arrested by the nationalist government, for they considered the communists to be a subversive group. After many months of imprisonment, I was released after I wrote a confession denouncing the communists and declaring my belief in the nationalists. In the next few years, I had some success as an actress. I remained active politically, and I married twice. Both marriages ended in divorce, and in 1937, I found myself in Yan'an, which was Mao's military headquarters. I was entertaining communist troops and teaching dramatics at an art academy. Mao came to deliver a lecture, and that was how we met. The attraction was great, and soon we formed a relationship. Unfortunately, Mao was still married to his third wife, Ho. Ho was very popular with the party, having accompanied Mao on the Long March. When our relationship became known, there was much disapproval. At one of the public schools, the students even had a strike to protest our cohabitation. But finally, there was a compromise worked out, and Mao was able to divorce Ho. Our marriage was approved by the party, but on condition that I refrain from any active part in politics. And that is how it was until the 1960s. Also, in that time, Mao conferred upon me yet another name, Zhengqing, meaning river green. The 1960s brought great changes to my life. Mao's Great Leap Forward policy had failed, and the party was under control of the moderates. The army, however, under the control of Lun Bao, was supportive of Mao. Mao disapproved of what he felt was a revisionist road leading to capitalism, which is what the moderates were following. He stressed ideological purity and asserted that economic growth would occur in China if the proper revolutionary fervor were maintained. His plan was to change the focus of society from the city to the country and to push the proletariat to take power for themselves. And so he sought to revive class struggle. He had great concern with maintaining and transmitting the spirit of true revolution to the next generation. For my part, I led a campaign to reform traditional Beijing drama. This was of the utmost importance, we felt, as it is the publicists and writers who set the ideological and intellectual tone of society. Make it revolutionary or ban it was a concept I supported. I personally forced directors to change plays, operas, and ballets to include a proletarian content, plays to be true to Mao's ideas about art for the masses. I demanded that dramatic works feature contemporary worker heroes inspired by Mao's philosophy, and that they remove references to competitive spirit, glorification of individual achievement, pacifism, and other forms of bourgeois sentimentality. There was much resistance to these changes, but I managed to replace 8 major theatrical works with new, updated versions. Mao relied on his status as a living legend with young soldiers, workers, and students to organize a group known as the Red Guard. I worked closely with the Red Guard. Mass meetings were held to incite them to action. At some of the rallies, I was cheered by thousands. Their task was to rebel against bureaucracy. They smashed temples and ransacked the homes of intellectuals, all for the Cultural Revolution. They set up revolutionary committees to replace established power structures in every institution of society. By 1967, however, the country was on the verge of anarchy, and we had to call for moderation. The Cultural Revolution had achieved many of its goals, however: decentralization of the government, heightened political consciousness, infusion of new blood into the party leadership, and a change of focus from city to countryside. The next few years were devoted to rebuilding the nation politically and economically. Again, I was involved in the cultural front. Plays and operas depicted proletarian heroes, brave, resourceful, devoted to the masses, patriotic, and loyal to the teachings of Mao. Now, however, the focus of the arts was on internal consolidation, not revolution. But the struggle was not finished. Now was to determine who would be Mao's successor. Mao passed away on September 8, 1976, a sad day for me and an even sadder day for all of China. But I had misread the support for Mao and his philosophy, and upon his death, the moderates returned to power. I and my colleagues, we were known as the Radical Gang of Four, were arrested. I was accused of many things, but I maintained that I had followed only Mao's line and the party's line. Everything I did, Mao told me to do. Some say I was a bad woman, but I say to you, I did nothing wrong. At my trial, there was much trumped-up evidence presented. At communist trials, the accused is considered guilty and is expected to make a confession. I made no confession. In 1981, I was found guilty on all counts brought against me and sentenced to death. It is not a crime to make revolution, I cried out when I heard the sentence, but I was ready to die. My sentence was suspended for 2 years to see how I would behave. I did not alter my stance, but my sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1983, and then in 1987 I was released. However, there was not much to go on for, and in 1991 I committed suicide. We've spoken today of Confucianism, and the goal of which is harmony and tranquility. The theme for Mao's China was revolution and war. The two themes hardly seemed to match. The world was horrified by the madness and violence that occurred during the Cultural Revolution, by the tens of thousands who were killed or committed suicide, and the hundreds of thousands who were imprisoned and placed in concentration camps. The new order supposedly sought purity and a higher morality. The old order was judged to be weak and contemptible. The Red Guard had destroyed much that was China, but when moderation returned, much of the old returned too. The old ways could not be completely destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jing. Our next character was one that you may be familiar with if you have, if you saw the movie The Last Emperor or read the book. This is the character Tzu, who lived from 1862 to 1908. It is portrayed today by Donna Runge, who is a counselor at North Idaho College.
Hello. My name is Tutsi, and I was the Empress Dowager from 1896 until 1908. I was born in 1835, which was 163 years ago. I want to tell you what it was like to live in those particular days, to be a woman, to be from China, to live behind the Forbidden Wall. It was not easy in some ways it was wonderful. When I was born of Manchurian descent, and I was able to become a concubine. So at 14, I went through the training to become a concubine. At age 16, I was chosen. I was chosen for several different reasons. There were 60 of us that tried out to be a concubine. We were chosen for our dignity, by our decorum, which my parents had to put together as much money and jewels and gowns as they had, and from my Manchur pedigree, but also chosen by the emperor's mother. As a concubine, I was choosing to give up my freedom to live with a husband. I didn't know if the emperor would ever choose me to lay by his side or to be with him, so it was a risk that I was taking. I was very curious as a child. I loved to read. Everyone that came through, I questioned them about anything they knew, knowledge about our country. As I moved into the Forbidden City, there was a library at my fingertips. And as you notice, my fingertips are quite long. 6-inch nails is a sign of people that don't need to work in our particular society. We even had nail guards that we had people design so that we could put over our nails. So some of our nails we could allow to be 6 inches. As I moved into the palace, it was fun. I had my own apartment. I was busy all day. I had 4 eunuchs that were at my service as a lot of maidens. I got to wear wonderful gowns, have nice jewelry, get to watch the theater. I was 16 years old. I didn't know if I would ever see the emperor or not. I was lucky because his first concubine of first rank could not bear a son. So one evening, I was chosen. So they wrapped me in a blanket, and one of the eunuchs carried me into the emperor's bed. It was recorded, and 9 months later, I bore his son. After I had his son, I went up to concubine of the second rank. As I lived my life, I kept getting more and more rankage. Every time I got a new rank, then I would earn more money or have more money put aside for myself. In the Forbidden City, I want to tell you what it was like to live there. 6,000 people behind the walls. 3,000 were women, 1 man, which was the emperor. Women were not allowed, or men were not allowed to live in the Forbidden City, except for the eunuchs. Eunuchs were men that had been castrated so that they would take care of us with no other things in mind. They were my friends. I took real good care of my eunuchs, and they took very good care of me because they were my spy channel, not only to China, but inside the Forbidden City. What did I actually stand for? Well, I believed in the Confucian state. I was a devout Buddhist. I had a lot of respect for our tradition, our Chinese heritage. And maybe that was part of my downfall. You can decide. You can be the judges on that. Let me tell you about the rest of my life. After I had my son, I became, like I said, more of a prominent person in the palace. And my husband was failing in health, and I asked him if I could possibly learn some things from him. He gave me some entry to some of his affairs. Everything I could find out about, of course I did. Remember, there's a concubine of first rank, so there's another person ahead of me. Well, she was pretty weak, and she was, pretty passive. So I made sure that she was a good friend and that I could use her because I knew that I could know more things and do more things if I kept her as my person that would trust me always. After the emperor died, or before he died, I took my son in because they took my son away from me for a certain period of time. I got him back. I took him into the emperor's bed and said, "You must declare him as your next emperor," which he did. Well, as he was small, I got to take part in running the country. When the emperor died, I had a very close confidant called Prince Kyung. He presided over the imperial court. There was a new regency that had evolved, and it was called Listening Behind Screens, striped because of the fact that the other concubine and myself could listen to affairs, but we had to do it behind a yellow curtain. Remember, women were not supposed to be in rule at that particular time. I really used Prince Kong as my mentor. He was very good to me, and I learned a lot of things. We met every single morning. In 1864, I decided I didn't need him any longer. So one day when we were having a meeting, I shrieked and yelled and had the palace guards come and carry him away because I wanted him demoted. So he was. He was demoted. That way I got to take more control. Before he was demoted, however, when he took control after the emperor died, he had beheaded some of the top people. He had also stripped some of the officers of their ranking. So we had had a change, and we had had people that maybe were a little bit more, would follow our rule. When my son, the emperor, took office, when he became the emperor at age 17, he had played too much when he was younger with the eunuchs, and he had too much, that he liked alcohol too much. He also was smoking a lot of opium. That was very sad to me because he did not want to take charge of ruling. So of course I kept doing that. He took himself a wife at the age of 18, and at 19 my son died. We had had so much fun when he was alive. He dressed in gowns like I did, and we frolicked together, and they had theater for us. We had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. When my son died, I died. I had no reason to be happy anymore. I was worried about his wife being pregnant, so she suddenly died of an overdose of opium. They say that was my fault. They say maybe I did that. Do you think so? Then, after my son died, I was pretty coy. I appointed an emperor who was 3 years old. Do you think he could run the country? Well, he couldn't. So therefore I did. So I kept running the country for another, well, he became emperor when he was 19, so another 16 years. As he took over, he decided that he would like to make some changes. I didn't like the foreigners. They said I was xenophobic. Do you think I was? Because I didn't like foreigners that much. They were okay as long as they came over our borders and did what they needed to do. But when they started to bring their Western ways into China, I didn't want that to happen. And so during his time of reign, my emperor nephew, when he was 19, he decided to have 100 days of reform. And I didn't want this to happen because he was going to change the educational system of our country. He was going to put the telegraph, and the British had already built a railroad system, and I bought that, and we took it all out. I didn't feel there was a need for that. Chinese tradition was working, even though the people were starving, and there was a lot of fighting going on outside the Forbidden Wall. As a female, I was not allowed to go outside the wall. But I was always informed as to what was going out. They say I was the most manipulated monarch because my minister kept me isolated because I stayed behind the wall. My nature was to remain quiet, private, solitary, and pensive. I really feel I wasn't the mastermind. I was sort of the victim of our society. And I wasn't an individual out for myself. So after these 100 days of reform that my nephew put into effect, I decided I didn't want that to happen to our country because I wanted the best for our country. So I called on my troops, had them come in, and the army arrested my nephew. They put him in our summer palace, which wasn't so bad, but it was called prison in the latest documentaries. He was confined there for 10 years. They said I didn't take very good care of him because he ate stale food, and he became sick, and I didn't want any doctors to look at him. So it's up to you to judge. Was I a bad person or not? My nephew died 1 year before I did. And I feel like I did the best job that I could to run my country. I suffocated advice, though, on which China could be built. Maybe that was something I shouldn't have done. But I was a strong leader. I was a very good empress. I died as I had lived, a creature of impulse and swiftly changed moods, a woman with a cause. But what was my cause? I ask you that.
Thank you, Empress Xi. You're so charming. We will have two of our guests now comment on the first three presentations. First, we will have Buddha, portrayed by Dr. Michael Myers from Washington State University, where he's an associate professor of philosophy. And so now, Dr. Myers, Buddha, if you will comment on the first three presentations we've had so far.
Well, good afternoon. Genghis Khan, Zhu Jiang Qin, all these three people lived so long after the Buddha. It's remarkable to think what I might have thought as the Buddha if I could have possibly known the lives of these three important people in Chinese and world history. You know, there are a number of stories that are told about the Buddha's past lives. They're gathered under a title called the Jataka Tales. They tell about his past lives both as a human and as an animal. They're full of wonder and rich detail. And the Buddha was said under meditation to be able to recall his past lives. But as I was listening to these three Chinese people, I thought, well, who would ever say that a person could recall what would happen in the future? Because after all, the future hasn't happened yet. There's no way anybody can see the future. Even the Buddha, I would say. So what changes can we see? Well, as the Buddha, I was born in northern India, but when Islam came into India and when Hinduism reasserted itself, Buddhism vanished almost completely. There are a few Buddhist pilgrims in India today, maybe 150,000 Buddhists living among the 900 million Indian people. I would be quite surprised to see India with no Buddhism, because even by the end of my life, at age 80, Buddhism was growing rapidly in India. But Buddhism spread. It spread to Sri Lanka, it spread to Southeast Asia, it spread to Tibet, but most famously, it spread to China. It spread to China, Korea, and Japan, and East Asia generally. And it's a wondrous thing to think of the reception of Buddhism in the lives of the people, both in action and reaction to Buddhism and to Buddhist philosophy. If I were able to say something to Genghis Khan, Zhu and Jiang Qin, it would be difficult to summarize. I would probably applaud upholding the Buddhist principles that were upheld as far as they were upheld in their human lives. I would applaud the spreading of the fruits of civilization and the advances of civilization that China generally has been so wonderfully responsible for. But I would caution and argue vehemently for nonviolence and for a more peaceful spread of the fruits of civilization. Thank you.
Confucius was also having the misfortune of living long, long before our other guests, also being born in 551 BC, a good millennia before the rest of these individuals. Confucius is portrayed by, our character Confucius is being portrayed by Dr. Aloysius Chang, also at Washington State University, where he's a professor of foreign language. Confucius?
After listening to the three Genghis Khan and Jing, as well as Cixi, we have learned just like a very good history class. We have learned a lot of things about the Chinese history, and during all these years in the Middle Age, as well as the present age, last century. And also, not only this history covered not only the so-called political aspect, but also as well as the so-called the imperial kind of succession, as well as the continuation. Now, I think their impact, without any doubt, still very lasting in the history of China. Some historian might argue whether they have really, in their own part, hit Chinese history with a very constructively, or with an aspect that the history will never forget. But the problem is this one. If we see that one, see the time they were in, like the first one in the Genghis Khan, that's the time we have, without any doubt, the Chinese empire was so large, even as you know, that time even went as far as to Europe, even just like today with the Hungary in the Mongolian, that's went very pretty wide. Now the second part with the both Cixi in the end of the Qing dynasty, it covered not only that time we see the so-called the industrialization of the Western world, but that in time in China also you do see the changes between the Chinese society and her relation with the outside world. Very interesting period. Now, without any further delay, we have heard so much from them, from themselves, as well as other remarks. I'd like just to point out one word as a conclusion, namely, I see a great similarity between these three historical characters. In one history, we might call the old kind of quasi, the persona revolutionaria, the people of during the revolutionary. Instead of using the word revolution, I prefer to use another word. The words I have chosen, not revolution, but reformation. I consider this more describe their life, describe their contribution to the society. Now, reformation in the sense, they realize what happened before. Although China is a society, try to keep the tradition, but they want to go any further to go to another stage and advancing. So in this sense, the word is playing the history of China, all become such a great reformers. Now finally, maybe it's one point also, do all these kind of historical character have something connected with some Confucianism? The answer is yes, because Confucianism, in a sense, since a part of the Chinese tradition, they are the messengers, very faithfully carrying on the Confucian's message to the Chinese people. So we want to congratulate their contribution in the Chinese history, and we're also thinking that the part today, if we see the Chinese history as a whole, their part, without any doubt, are still very, very kind of alive and try to excite us. Through their study of the time they were in, we can also see the continuation of the Chinese history as a whole. Thank you very much.
That concludes our presentations. Now we'd like to open up the floor for questions. We have a microphone up front. Please feel free to come up front and ask a question, but please direct your question to the person you'd like to answer it. If it's to all of our guests, then please make that clear. Do we have any questions?
Confucius and Great Buddha, I'm humbled. To the Dowager Empress, I was astounded to see your great beauty, your raiments, your fine nails. I did, however, study the concept of foot binding in your country. It baffles me how a woman of such grace and nobility could have gone from a low-ranking concubine to such a high-ranking concubine, which with feet as large and ugly as yours. Can you explain that to me?
Thank you, sir. My feet were not bound because I am from Manchurian descent. The Chinese later their feet were bound. Since I'm from Manchurian descent, Manchurian women would ride beside their husbands on horseback, and so they did not find a need for that. So I did not have, that's why I have such big ugly feet. And also, let's see, forgot the other part of your question.
How you rose so quickly.
Oh, how I rose so quickly. I was very smart, very energetic, very intellectual, and in order to become a concubine, the Manchurian descent also assisted in that. And even though I was not a ruler, I was able to use people to help me do that all the way along. There were lots of people that I beheaded, and I changed my ministers when my emperor nephew was in power. I changed my ministers every 3 years, so nobody could satisfy their own desires. And so I was very clever in the way that I did run the country. Does that answer it?
Okay, are there any other questions? Well, if there are no more questions, do any of our guests here have any questions for either Buddha or for Confucius? No further questions here? Well, we have a question. Okay.
This is for each member of the panel. My question is, how do you view today's society as being different from society back then? And is it better or is it worse?
Are you referring strictly to China?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Should we start on this end? Dowager Empress, and we'll work this way.
Okay. I can just answer for my period in China because I'm not well versed on China today. But I do feel my character did what she thought was necessary to preserve the heritage of the country, and that she felt like Western influence could damage the country in general and all the innovations and so forth. She was not open to those at all. You know, compared to the United States, I would say we're very open to any innovations today. But China today, I'm not so sure.
Well, I didn't die until 1991, and so I think, I believe personally that China is much better than it was than when Mao Zedong was in power. Certainly, my character would not feel that way. She was much against any Western influence, and she used her power to get even with people who had slighted her even 30 years before the Cultural Revolution. She was a very vengeful woman, and I think that with the moderates taking control and the gradual opening, I think China is probably in much better condition today than it was when Mao and I were in power.
I'm from the barbaric north. As a Mongolian, I believe that my nomadic lifestyle is superior. So I looked with disdain on the sedentary life of the Chinese. The idea of tending crops all day was beyond my comprehension. A man should be on horseback, hunting wild animals, or conducting war, not tending rice. So I would feel the same about today's China as I did China in my time. It would be a nice place to visit, but I would not want to live there. I would want them to pay me tribute to keep me from visiting too often. I tolerated their religions because I found you could not fight a religious war and win. I was a politician. I had my own religious beliefs. Spirits guided me in my battle plans. So I left the religions of China to the people of China.
I wonder with you whether things get better, whether they stay the same or get worse. It's sure difficult to judge. If we broaden the question outside of China, I would argue that one of the beauties of American civilization has been the growth of a large middle class, the ability to educate most of the people, and even to grant the benefits of higher education to a large segment of the population. I think China and other countries in the world are also working toward those fruits. As far as measuring, I would just caution that those are fruits that we have worked for and earned, and they're not givens, and they can be in some danger of going away. So I would hope that we could continue to work for a widening of the middle class. That's not upper class. That's not greed I'm talking about. I'm talking about enough, not too much. And the education of the people for basic education and the higher education of those who have the ability and desire.
The Chinese society in the 21st century, without any doubt, we see a lot of phenomenal change, in what you might call them progress. Now, to answer your question, is for the better or for the worse? In one sense, this kind of progress, this kind of change is necessary. Is the circumstance, there's a demand for this kind of this fact. Now, to boil it down, does China today really changed? If you see the so-called traditional value, and still there. So in that sense, it only changed the outside. Now, whether inside the spirit of the Chinese changed, that I think it changed, but very little. So still want to show the great respect and still have the so-called to carry on the tradition of China. So in this sense, to answer your question, you might say, in one sense, there's a China changed material speaking. However, the other side, whether you change it, quote unquote, spiritual or the so-called in the spirit of China, the civilization of China, they still kept so-called Confucian tradition. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Any questions back there, or you have one? Okay.
I usually don't ask questions, but I want to, first of all, on behalf of the Popcorn Forum and the Convocations, thank all of you who've participated today. You've been so helpful, and what we're all about at Untitled College, and that is examining issues and dilemmas. But I have worked with you a long time, and several people here, for example, you three panelists, have done other characters in the past, which I must say were much more democratic in their approach than who you've done today. But I would like for all of you, if you would, please, to step out of character. These wonderful people who have come and been here all day, they have not had the opportunity that I have to talk with you about the Chautauqua Society and how role-playing characters in history is another technique of learning that's a very powerful one. And the master of modern technology will be here on Wednesday and Thursday. He's renowned around the world and a great supporter of the Chautauqua Society. And I'll direct this to the three panelists here since I've worked with you a lot. Would you share with the audience what it means to you to engage in the Chautauqua performance? You've spent months preparing in past years, and again this year. You have attended a workshop with Dr. Clay Jenkinson on this kind of performance. Just share with the audience how it's affected you over these years and what you get out of it, and does it change you in any way?
Well, it looks like I'm the one who gets to start. One thing, this is a lot of work. When Tony first asks you about this, you don't think about the amount of research that's going to go into this. And for instance, this year, I was not familiar with a lot of Chinese society. And this really does improve your understanding of the culture and of the country itself. It's really very beneficial. I think probably those of us that participate gain much more than does the audience. Each year I say that I will never do this again. Each year Tony says, "Will you?" And in a moment of
Weakness.
Yes, weakness, that's it. I agree, and I complain about it a great deal beforehand, but I feel that it's very beneficial, and I won't rule out next year. But
Well, I would just like to say it is a lot of work. Sort of like having a baby. You forget the pain after a while, so then you decide to have another one. And that's when Tony is so sweet. When he asks you to do this, it's very hard to turn him down. Plus the benefits we get ourselves personally. I love the educational part. I'm like Karen, I didn't know that much about China, and actually have not been interested in China as much as now. I have a real thirst and hunger to learn more. I've read 2 books this thick to find out about my character, and I've probably left out half of what I wanted to say about her. But was very intrigued by the character. Another thing that I feel is not only a personal learning experience and a growth for us, but it's also a community. It's a family. It joins us here at NIC, which I think we have a very close family anyway. But for example, 2 instructors, Karen's a registrar, I'm a counselor, and so we get to talk together, work together, and so forth. And I think it's a real enriching experience for us.
I do it because it's fun. I get to pick a character that I don't know anything about and read so that I can become that person. It's odd to spend as much time on preparation as we do so that we can portray a character for 10 or 15 minutes and then answer questions from people so that we can stay in character. The benefit to me is that I do get to work with other people at the college that are outside my realm in Cider Hall, which is part of the science facility that nobody comes to visit because who wants to go into that building? So it is part of the collegiate experience. North Idaho College is a commuting college. Many of our students come here and go home and do not partake of a collegiate experience. The popcorn forum is as close as we can come to having a thoughtful dialogue about a topic either from the past or from the present or a blend. So I always like to participate. It is fun.
Jim, would you do your experience? You've done a character.
I've done 2 characters, and this is my first stint as moderator. And I thought it would be a lot easier being moderator, but it turned into an all-day affair, and quite frankly, I'm tired. But it has been an enjoyable experience, and especially with dealing with my own fellow colleagues from North Idaho College and being able to meet colleagues from nearby Washington State University. That's been a very pleasurable experience. For me, it was being a moderator was nice because I had a whole breadth of information I needed to get about Beijing, about the various characters, and so I had an overview of all of this, which was a different approach than being a specific character. So it gave me a nice breadth of information that allowed me to appreciate the whole, I guess, if you will. It's also nice to be able to be in contact with people, to be thinking in terms of getting this put together, to work with Tony, to work with many of the people in the community and at the college that helped bring and put the Popcorn Forum together. I didn't really have a full appreciation with all the people that were involved in this process till now. And really there is an extraordinary effort of not only people here at NIC, but out there in the community that make this happen. So it is a way of getting to know your community members better and appreciating this whole Coeur d'Alene area all the more.
Can I have the honor of guest?
Sure. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this, and it's really been a great experience, and I thank you very much for inviting me. I've been to quite a few academic conferences where we as philosophers go and read papers and listen to other people read papers. And I've always thought that that's a kind of forum that's flat and objective. But after going through today, I realized that that's kind of acting too. And there's a kind of honesty to this sort of series because you're putting the act right out there. So it's really been a great experience. I can see how it develops community here. And I think the benefits for dialogue are really immeasurable.
Hi, Jim. Well, I'll give a very short conclusion here. Since this morning we were heard about the so-called Beijing, and many students in Pullman used to ask me, Professor Chang, can you give us something about, we are thinking of going to China to visit Beijing, where to see, okay? Now, if you have only one day in Beijing, please see the palace, the Imperial Palace. And there's another one outside in the south part of the city called Tiantan, the Temple of Heaven. If you have 2 or 3 days, you can go to another place outside the city called the Yiheyuan, the Summer Palace. It's a beautiful place, just like Coeur d'Alene. The lake and the building, it's beautiful. Now, if you have more time to visit, number 4, I suggest to visit is the Mingling, the tomb of Ming Dynasty. That's the north of Beijing. If you have more days to stay in Beijing, number 5 is the so-called Changcheng, the Great Wall. The Chinese, they translate Changcheng, the long wall. In English, the Great Wall. That's a beautiful place. Very historic. That place was built before Christ in the Qing dynasties. Still, I think, almost several thousand miles long. Okay. Now, if you still have time to stay in Beijing, there are 2 more places to see. One is Xishan. Xishan, what's Xi? Xi meaning west, the West Mountain. That's a beautiful Buddhist monastery. The monastery is very nice, very quiet, very nice. If you still have some more money left to spend in Beijing, the number 8 place called the Zhoukou Dian. What's Zhoukou Dian? Those are only for scholars. So that's where we call where the Beijing Men first found in that place. So those 8 places try to see Beijing. That's a very, very nice place. It's a very cultural city. And also, I really enjoyed very much today. I have so many to see friends, Tony and Jim, and come to NIC to see all you. Thank you very much.
Well, I think this concludes today's Popcorn Forum. Thank you for attending, and I hope that you have enjoyed your trip to Beijing.